Hello, my name is Alexander Isles, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about the sleeping beauties of Anglo-Saxon England. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to be talking about bed burials, and if you follow the news you may have seen in Harpole, Northamptonshire, there was an amazing bed burial discovered recently, and you can see the reconstruction of it just behind me here. And we have an Anglo-Saxon woman, or a woman from the early medieval period in England, and she was found with an amazing necklace made of coins, garnets, pendants, glass, and a wonderful cruciform gold and garnet decoration in the centre, dating roughly between 630 and 670 AD. And she is one of a number of Anglo-Saxon bed burials that have been discovered over the years, and it's an amazing British or English tradition that seems to have occurred during the early medieval period. So I thought I'd make a video about it and tell you a little bit more about it today. So when we're looking at these, they're a part of a wonderful sort of tradition that had occurred of burial during the early medieval period. So during the 5th and 6th century, it was generally men who were buried with weapons and also with great treasures. So famously, Sutton Hoo and the Pritwell burials are both wonderful examples of this. So if I say Sutton Hoo, you'll probably think of the ship burial with all of the gold, the garnets, the treasure, all of that sort of thing. And Pritwell as well was another example where they had a chambered burial with also a lot of treasures as well that were buried with the deceased. So men generally in the 5th and 6th centuries were buried with these great weapons, these great treasures, and it was something that was seen quite a lot within early medieval England. What happens though is in the 7th century, around about 620 to 630 AD, men's burials just stop having these treasures in. It just almost occurs so rapidly that within a sort of a decade, men just stop getting this treatment and they just get buried instead. There's still a little bit of weapons burial going on, but not the great treasures that we find from the earlier period, more contemporary with Sutton Hoo, that sort of thing. Then, from around about 640 onwards, you start seeing this having right up to about 680, 690, really rich female burials. And it's almost like they go, well, we've previously buried all the men with all of this stuff, now we're going to transfer over to women. And it's something that it's one of these really weird mysteries, or like no one really knows why it occurs during the early medieval period. And so the Harpole one right behind me in Northamptonshire is a wonderful example of this. We have a woman buried on a bed, and when she's buried on this bed, she then has this wonderful necklace of coins and garnets, coloured glass, and a wonderful gold cruciform, so basically cross-shaped like pendant in the centre. And this is then seen as quite a high status sort of item. And alongside this as well, still inside a soil block, but probably by the time you watch this video, they discovered a crucifix, which is a cross obviously, but then the ends are made of little gold crosses as well, gold and silver crosses. So there's this wonderful sort of item that was buried with her as well, which is very much a sort of Christian influenced or Christian item. So these are the sort of things you find in these bed burials. Now, to give you a wider context, from around about the 3rd century across in Egypt, there were Coptic bed burials where people were laid to rest on beds and buried in Egypt on beds. Then this spread throughout the 5th and 6th centuries into continental Europe, especially in sort of Western Germany and in Gaul or Francia at the time. And it's possible that the Frankish kingdoms were inspired by the Eastern Romans, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire, and so they wanted to copy them and they started doing bed burials. But across there in continental Europe, both men and women are equally buried within bed burials. There's no sort of like, it's a 50-50 rough split between male and female bed burials. But when the tradition comes over into Britain in the 7th century, it is specifically a female tradition. Across here in Britain, in England especially, you do not see, there's possibly only one example of a male bed burial. All the others are female. And so when you have this, they are generally buried lying on a bed, and when they're lying on a bed, generally the organic material of the bed, so the wood has rotted away, but we see all the fixtures that give us this interpretation of a bed. And so when we get all the fixtures, we can see that the body is laid out on a bed And then when they're laid out on the bed, they normally have these really high status gold and garnet or gold treasures with them, with lots of Christian iconography, so like crosses, stuff like that. For instance, Street House Loafers in Redcar, Teesside, North Yorkshire way, she was buried with a shellfish-like pendant, and obviously the shellfish is connected to the way of St. James Compostela, and so we can see there's items that can be interpreted within a Christian sort of milieu or Christian sort of influence that are being buried with these women in the 7th century. So that's something that we sort of have to understand. Now, while they have Christian iconography, it's not overtly Christian, and there's a lot of questions about what causes these bed burials. So one of the questions is that, are they actually female migration? So are these women from Francia, which is already Christian, or from parts of Germany, and they have migrated into the British Isles to marry, or to live here, or become parts of secular monasteries, which I'll touch upon in a second. And so they've come across and they've brought the tradition of bed burials with them. So these men aren't migrating, they aren't coming into the British Isles, they aren't coming into what would become England, and so they're not bringing the bed burial with them, but the women are. And so when they come across, they ask to be buried in their home tradition. Obviously, isotopic analysis or genetic analysis needs to be done, and it hasn't been done yet, so we can't say that this is overtly a case. Or it could be a brand new ritual inspired by stuff going on across in Francia or Old France and in Old Germany, and sort of inspired by that. And so people are then taking that tradition and they're using it, but it's now got much more of a Christian iconography or Christian example to it. People are using a much more Christian example when they're using this. And this could be inspired by the idea of, in Christianity, of the idea of a sleeping Christ. So someone doesn't die, they're just asleep waiting for the resurrection. So this could be an example where these women are being buried with these items that have strong Christian symbolism. They're asleep, they're lying on a bed. And we also see in other parts of the Germanic world, especially southern Scandinavia, when there are long ship burials or ship burials, people are often laid to rest on beds. They're not seen as dead, they're seen as just sleeping, and they've got all of their items around them. People visit the funerals, you can see this in burials from Norway, other locations like that. So is this a very specific English variation on a bed burial where the person is not dead, they're just waiting, they're waiting for the resurrection, and they are buried with items that are very much signifying their religious belief? Alongside this as well, we've also got some quite interesting sort of additional things to take into account. This also idea of a secular Christian living. So within the 7th century, we start seeing Christianization, so the expansion of Christianity through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, conversion of kings to Christianity, and as they convert to Christianity, we often see that maybe when a king passes away, his widow or some of his daughters will join local monasteries and they'll become abbesses or leaders of the religious community. So when they become religious community leaders, we see a sort of a power within Anglo-Saxon women where they're leading joint monasteries of both male and female monks and nuns, and they become incredibly influential with the Christianization process. You can see this in Northumberland with very powerful women like St Hild, who is a part of the royal dynasty of the area of Yorkshire, or Daria as it's called back then. So she is a part of the dynasty, and she is related to King Edwin, who is a saintly Christian convert who was martyred. So again, there's that sort of connection where, as a part of the dynasty, she continues that Christianization, she founds monasteries and churches, and is then a very important part of the Christianization of the Kingdom of Northumbria. So there's a possibility that rather than joining the monasteries, these women are living in an example of a sort of a nunnery. They live in the secular Christian style. So they continue to take on the lifestyle of living within a nunnery, but without taking the oaths. So they could then retain their land, they could retain possibly their influence within local society, and they could live as a woman of God without actually being a part of the nunnery. And therefore they'd be highly influential, they could be very wealthy, again reflected in the items they're buried with, and it's sort of one of the things we see there. What is interesting though is the treasures buried with them. You do see a lot of cross-shaped pendants or Christian influenced items. So for instance, famously there's the Trumpington cross. Just outside of Cambridge is Trumpington, and there's a wonderful example of a pectoral cross. Another example is the Wilton cross, which included a coin of Heraclius, who was an Eastern Roman emperor who ruled from about 610 to 641. You've then got the Ixworth cross from Suffolk. Again, you have a sort of a cluster of these in sort of East Anglia and that sort of area of these bed burials and crosses. And even though it wasn't discovered with a bed burial, you've also got the Holderness cross from North Yorkshire, and then famously you've also got St Cuthbert's pectoral cross, which is the only example of a man being buried with a pectoral cross. Now the interesting thing about this is, could it be a grave gift? So one of the famous nuns or leaders of the Northumbrian church at his death then added it to his grave goods, and therefore he was buried with it, because we don't generally find these sort of pectoral crosses being buried with men. Another good example is in the Staffordshire hoard. We have the amazing Staffordshire hoard pectoral cross, and when you've got that pectoral cross, again it could be that the Staffordshire hoard is more than likely a recycling deposit, where this huge amount of stuff is being brought together and is then being processed to be recycled to other items in a later period. So it could be that this was maybe a princess's or a high status woman within Mercia or within one of the other kingdoms that has then been brought together to be reprocessed, remelted down, and then produced into new items within a later century. So that's another option there for the Staffordshire hoard. And I'm sure I'll do another video on that in the future. But this is an amazing thing, is that with these bed burials, we've got an amazing story right here of these high status women who maybe are possibly royal or possibly just women of independent means, who are maybe widowed or have chosen not to marry, but still control a lot of resource. And so because they control resources, they are able, therefore, when they are buried, to be buried in a much more, a style that shows off their wealth, that shows off their independent means, but also this new faith that is coming through. And it's possible that Christianity gave these women this freedom to choose this form of burial, to choose, I am in control of my own fate, and so they became central figures in their local area. For instance, in North Yorkshire, in Redcar, the Loafers Street House burial, we see a bed burial in the centre, which is the one I mentioned with the scalloped pectoral jewellery. She is buried in a bed burial, and she is in the centre, and all the other burials in the area form a sort of a square around her, and she is in the centre. So Sir's central burial with her bed burials, the core central burial, and then all the other burials in a double line of burials all the way around fall on this square. And it's almost like, she is the core focus, and people are coming together to recognize her. So she could be like almost viewed almost saintly. And so we've got this very interesting dynamic here where these bed burials are becoming a focus, and possibly a focus of women of independent means, not connected to tribe necessarily, or to men, or to, that sort of thing, but instead freed maybe more by Christianity and by this new faith. They are now able to control their own outcomes, and therefore choose this form of burial, which previously men, just like around about 30, 40 years before, would have chosen. But now the women are able to do it, and so they start doing it until burial with items becomes unfashionable at the start of the 8th century. And by the 8th century, because of the widespread adoption of Christianity and the belief of the resurrection, there's no longer a need to bury things for your afterlife or that sort of thing. So instead, people fully choose to just be wrapped in a white cloth and buried in the ground with their feet facing towards Jerusalem. And so because of that, we see this transformation, this movement away from grave goods, and therefore this ends as well around about 680, 690 AD. So I'd really like to know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on it? Is it a sort of a continuation of female pagan power, or is it an adoption of new Christian power? Or is there a totally different meaning that I've maybe not seen and you think is so obvious that you'd like to say? Please write it down in the comments. Always be civil to one another, and I really look forward to seeing your different thoughts about this. But I really have enjoyed sharing it with you. If you'd like to support me further, I do have a Ko-fi account and a Patreon account, which you can find in the description, but no pressure whatsoever if you don't want to do that. In the meantime, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to telling you more history in the next episode. Until then, though, stay safe and well, and thank you.